Mysterious incident in the Antarctic. Oshikawa Shunrou. 1. In order to tell this strange story, there are two things that the reader must remember beforehand. The first is that recently, a group of European scholars have been repeatedly sending out Antarctic expeditions, despite numerous failures, as if they were trying to discover some secret at the edge of the earth. The second is that in the ancient, unknowable times that are hidden by the darkness of history, there was a kingdom that had gathered together ancient civilizations near Chus, which overlooks the endless desert to the east on the west coast of Africa, now called the Barbarian Land. Its name was passed down by word of mouth as the Lapis Lazuli country. During the kingdom's most prosperous period, there was a curious king who seemed to have been inspired by something, and one day he gathered timber from all over the country to build an amazing giant ship, and made the interior of the ship as luxurious as a palace. He loaded it with all the ancient treasures, 100 brave warriors, and 100 beautiful women, and set sail from the country's port to travel to countries around the world. However, while the ship was being tossed about by the waves of the South Pacific, perhaps it was caught in a great storm or attacked by pirates, but it disappeared completely, and the waves of the South Pacific remained silent. Where did it go, is a question that still remains even thousands of years later. These two things, that is, the fact that a group of European scholars are currently frequently sending out Antarctic expeditions, and the fact that a huge ship from an ancient civilization has gone missing, leaving an eternal mystery behind, do not appear to be related on the surface. However, writing it out like this, some might think there is some connection. But think about it, even stone pillars from thousands of years ago are now completely destroyed, let alone a huge wooden ship. No matter how hard a curious scholar searches, there is no way that such a thing would be found at this point. However, there are principles in this world that go beyond reason, and those of you who have read the following story will be amazed and wide-eyed to think that such secrets, such mysteries, could exist in this world. 2. It was about 2 months ago that one night the Antarctic expedition ship of Dr. Montes, the leading Portuguese scientist, secretly departed from the Gulf of St. Ubez. Two beautiful young girls were playing on the shore of the seldom-traveled Cape Delha. Both were the beloved daughters of Dr. Montes, who had a villa on the scenic cape. The two girls were happily wandering the shoreline, chasing crabs and collecting shellfish, but after a while the older girl suddenly cried out, "Oh! Something strange is floating down the river." The younger girl was also surprised by the voice, and as they stood side by side and looked, a pitch-black empty beer bottle rolled down to their feet, one by one, as the waves crashed on the shore. "Oh, there's nothing we can do about this," said the older daughter, picking it up in her fingers and tossing it into the sea, but the empty bottle was again buffeted by the crashing waves and soon rolled back to her feet. "What a stubborn empty bottle," said the younger daughter, this time picking it up and preparing to throw it, when at that moment she heard someone call from behind her. "What are you two doing? What did you pick up?" She turned around and saw it was her father, Dr. Montes, walking forward with a smile on his face. They both looked happy and clung to his neck from either side. "Father, this bottle is a strange one. It's as if it's alive. No matter how many times you throw it, it keeps rolling." "Oh, it's an empty sailor's beer bottle," the doctor said, taking the bottle from his younger sister's hand and looking at it. "This is strange. The bottle's stopper, cork, is already rotten, and the seaweed growing outside the bottle definitely doesn't grow in these nearby waters. It's seaweed from the South Seas, seaweed from the South Seas. Just by looking at the seaweed growing out of the bottle, you can tell this bottle is very old. I think it must have been thrown from the deck of a shipwreck." As expected of Portugal's #1 scientist, his insight was quite keen. As he spoke, the doctor held up the bottle and held it up to the sunlight. "Oh, there is something really strange here," he exclaimed, his curiosity overflowing. Impatiently trying to pull out the stopper, he threw it at a nearby rock, where the bottle broke into pieces, revealing a yellow piece of paper with something written in small letters inside. The doctor quickly picked it up, took out his pince-nez, and put it on his nose. With his brows furrowed, he began to read intently. It was written in pencil, and the writing was now hazy, but after reading a few lines, the doctor suddenly seemed astonished. "Holy shriek! Miraculous! Miraculous! Miraculous!" he exclaimed, as if he had discovered a great secret. He immediately shoved the yellow paper into his clothes bag and, without saying a word, ran off to his villa on the Cape. The two daughters were stunned, and followed after him, saying, "Father, what is it?" But the doctor didn't even look back. He rushed into his own study in the villa, locked the door, spread the mysterious document on the table, and, furrowing his brow even more deeply, began to read intently again. The two daughters crowded outside the room and knocked on the locked door, muttering, "Father, please tell us if there's anything unusual." "It's terrible to lock the door," but the doctor pretended not to notice and simply said, "It's of no use for you to hear." In fact, the doctor even kept it a secret from his daughters, but I would like to introduce to you, my dear readers, the extremely mysterious events written in this document, without hiding anything. 3. The document began with the following tragic words. "If this bottle does not sink to the bottom of the ocean, if this bottle does not break into rocks thousands of feet high, some people on this earth will one day learn that a great secret lies at the end of the world. I am a Spanish traveler named Lagan. I left my home country with the purpose of traveling around the world, traveling through Europe, Asia, and America, seeing strange things everywhere and experiencing interesting circumstances, and finally arrived in Morocco on the west coast of Africa. If I boarded a ship going north from here and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, I should have been able to return to my home country safely, but what a pervert I am, having traveled almost a seventh of the world. My curiosity was still not satisfied, so I boarded a strange ship from the port of Mazagan in Morocco, hoping to reach more unusual places and see interesting things. This ship was a 3-masted sailing ship, its sides covered with rusted blue copper, and at a glance I knew it was a very old ship. The captain was an African. His complexion was like red copper, his eyes were like starbursts, and half of his face was covered with a gray beard, making him look like an extremely rough person. He was accompanied by 7 sailors, all of whom were natives, and when they stood and walked, I wondered if they were wild animals, but they seemed to have a surprisingly docile nature. This ship was originally a pearl fishing ship, traveling along the west coast of Africa, across the South Pacific, and heading south into a region that could almost be described as a strange place, so it was not designed to carry either passengers or cargo. So how did I manage to get on board? Just as I reached the pier at the port of Mazagan in Morocco, I happened to notice this strange ship anchored nearby. I asked a bystander what kind of ship it was, and he told me it was leaving that port the next day to fish for pearls, bound for an unknown remote island in the south. My curiosity was piqued, and I couldn't wait any longer, so I immediately rowed my boat up to the gangway and, unable to speak the language, made hand gestures to beg to join the ship. When the captain refused, I managed to get him to hand me $200 in gold coins, and was finally allowed on board. Of course, there were no fancy guest rooms or anything like that, so I laid out a blanket in a storeroom-like area at the very bottom of the ship and used it as a living room and bedroom, but on clear days there was no need to be confined to such a dim place. I had intended to spend most of the voyage on deck in the fresh breeze, and my only enjoyment was to reach an isolated southern island unknown to the world as soon as possible and see the fascinating sight of pearl diving. However, to my surprise, this very ship had become a cursed ship for me. 4. The name of this ship was Biafra. I was allowed to board and left Mazagan port around noon the next day. We headed south, heading towards the west coast of Africa. The sails were almost full due to the favorable wind that was blowing at that time. The waves breaking against the bow were raining down on the blue sea, and the speed was so fast that even steamships could not match it. The route along the west coast of Africa was once the only route from Europe to Asia, and people still remember the many scary experiences that ships had when they went around the Cape of Good Hope. However, since the Suez Canal was opened, it has been extremely rare for ordinary ships to make this voyage, and I could hardly see any steamships during the long voyage. I could only see a suspicious fishing boat with a triangular sail occasionally hiding between the waves. I heard that pirates were constantly rampant around here in the past, but I don't remember any of them now. During the day, I usually go out on the deck of the sailing ship Biafra, looking at the smoke-like African continent to the left and the endless ocean to the right, and at night, as long as there is no moon, I sleep early in my bedroom in the bottom of the ship. During this time, we passed the coast of Cape Bronco, passed between the islands of Sealbaro, where it is said that witches once lived, and on the 35th day of the voyage, we arrived at Table Bay, at the southern tip of Africa. Here, the ship is fully stocked with drinking water, food, etc., and when we leave the bay and head further south, there is no sign of land to the right or left, and even when I look back, The shadow of the African continent has disappeared, and the future is just a vast expanse of water and sky, and I am struck by a feeling of loneliness. 5 days had passed since we left Table Bay, the tip of Africa, and one evening, when the wind had calmed and the ship was moving very slowly, I leaned against the foremast on deck and looked around. As far as I could see, there was neither ship nor island, but only a huge whale floating in the tide in the eerie blue waves. Seeing such a scene, anyone would be overcome with a kind of indescribable sense of loneliness. I did not know what condition the ship was in, or in which direction we were heading, so although I felt timid, my loneliness gradually grew worse and worse, and finally I could not bear it. So I turned to the captain, who had just come up to me, and asked, "When shall we reach the remote island we are aiming for?" I realized that this was a question and answer, but the captain waved his hairy hand back and forth and answered callously, "If it is not the time to reach it, we will not reach it." He just passed by, and I had no way to get in touch with him. I looked towards the stern and saw 7 sailors at the helm, talking to one another as they steered and steered the sails. Their voices sounded like monkeys, and suddenly, as if they had bitten something, they stopped talking and turned their eyes in one direction. I was drawn in as well, and looking in the direction they were looking, I was in the southwest, just beyond the horizon, when I could see a faint, black object. Was it a giant bird, a whale, a ship, or an island? If it was an island, then that would be the remote island I was heading for, but it seemed not to be an island. If it was not an island, then what was it? I wanted to see for myself what it was, so I did not leave the deck for a while longer. However, the black thing seemed to be getting closer, but not getting any closer. Eventually, the sun set and the sea became dark. Only one light was shining on our ship. I could not see anything on all sides, so I had no choice but to go down the only entrance on the ship and enter the bedroom in the bottom of the ship. Thinking that at times like this I should go to bed early, and the only thing I could do is spend the night in my dreams, I quickly pulled a blanket over myself and lay down, but there was an unusual rumble in my chest and I could not fall asleep easily. This must have been what they call a premonition. 5. However, within an hour, I began to doze off, and while I was asleep I was unaware of the time, and before I knew it, it was midnight. In my dream, I was climbing up a terrifyingly tall tower, and while I was gazing out at the world around me through my gauntlets, I suddenly slipped and fell headfirst. I woke up screaming, and although it seemed that I was falling from the tower, it was just a dream. In fact, I had originally been sleeping on the starboard side of the ship's bottom, but before I knew it, I had fallen onto the port side. I cried out and rose to my feet, but the bottom of the ship seemed to be hitting a big wave, and my feet became unsteady and I was about to collapse. Then, while I was sleeping, the weather suddenly changed, and the sea appeared to become extremely rough. Praying that the waves would calm down quickly, I lay down on the bottom of the ship again. But all at once, the ship must have collided with something, as there was an incredible noise, and it tilted slightly to starboard. "Reef! Reef! I immediately cried out. I did not want to collide with another ship in such an open sea, which could be called a world beyond human reach, so I braced myself against the springs to see what kind of reef we had hit. I jumped up and ran, unsteady on my feet, and stumbled several times, but finally managed to endure and run towards the only hatch between the bottom of the ship and the deck. On the way, I heard strange screams coming from the deck and the sounds of people's wild and clamoring footsteps. However, such screams and footsteps always occur when the ship runs aground on a reef, so I didn't think it was particularly suspicious. Eventually, I reached a ladder leading from inside the ship to the deck. I was so absorbed in climbing the ladder that I popped my head out onto the deck from the hatch. I was so shocked at that moment. Clouds were flying in the sky like arrows, and the ship was racing along with a speed that is unimaginable now, blown by fierce winds and hit by raging waves. But that wasn't what surprised me. Look! Look! From a gap in the clouds, on the deck lit by the stars like a ghost fire, a group of dark shadows were fighting, about 20 people in total, and they were not just the sailors from our sailing ship. Oh, what is this? What is this? The ship had definitely not collided with a reef. I had heard the sound of something colliding with something earlier, and it was a pirate ship about to board our ship. As the sun was setting, I saw a mysterious black shadow far away, just beyond the horizon. That must have been the terrifying pirate ship. The pirates suddenly invaded the deck of our ship, about 14 or 15 in number, flashing swords in their hands. They surrounded the captain and 7 other sailors, slashing and slashing and slashing. Blood flew like a waterfall, and in the blink of an eye 4 or 5 of our sailors had been cut down. I was so terrified that I instinctively hid my head under the entrance. The deck of the sailing ship Biafra is now a hellish place, with the wind raging, the waves roaring, and the screams of the pirates and crew fighting on a ship that feels as if it has been hit by a major earthquake that could shake the world, making it sound like the voices of hell in this world. I was so terrified that I hid my head, which had once been exposed on the deck, and hid myself in the middle of the ladder under the hatch. However, when I listened carefully, I heard what sounded like the screams of the crew getting lower and lower, and only the cries of the pirates, which sounded like wolves howling, got louder and louder. I was not in a good mood, so I quietly opened the hatch again, wanting to see something scary, and looked out at the starry sky above the deck. What a sight! 6 of the 7 crew members had already been cut down, and only the captain remained alive. He had sustained several serious injuries and, covered in blood, he ran between the corpses, as a dozen pirates flashed their swords and chased him. The captain cried and screamed, and grabbed the corpses. Using it as a shield, I desperately defended for a while, but I was no match for the large numbers, so I ran around the main mast, along the compass, and fled from bow to stern, but there was nowhere to run. The sword was already closing in from behind, and I couldn't hold it any longer. Just as I was about to jump into the raging waves, a pirate leapt at me like a fierce tiger and cut the captain down with a single yell. The captain's body was split in two, and before he had time to scream, he collapsed. His blood gushed out, and the area was covered in crimson. It was such a tragedy that I couldn't help but cry out as the captain collapsed, but to me, that cry was the cry of great disaster. The pirates, who had already slaughtered all the crew and thought there was no one left on the ship, heard my voice and turned towards me in shock, but as soon as they saw me, their devilish eyes gleamed and they all started shouting something, and they rushed towards me with their swords pointed at them. "This is getting big. I can't stand to be caught," so I immediately hid my head under the entrance and quickly closed the lid. At that moment, the pirates were already around the entrance, and their footsteps on the floor above sounded wild, like the howling of wolves and the screaming of monkeys, and they were shouting and cursing. They were saying, "Open up, open up." If I opened it, it would be a big disaster, so I stretched out both hands and held down the lid from below with all my might, while the pirates tried to pull it free from above. Fortunately, this sailing ship only had this one access hatch between the bottom of the ship and the deck, and for me, this was the Thermopylae fortress. As long as this fortress remained intact, my life would continue. As long as I was alive, I was desperate to somehow break through this hatch, and so were the pirates. The pirates were furious that the access hatch would not open easily, and raised their feet to kick the lid, but the surface of the lid was smooth and covered with iron plates, so it was difficult to break through. Meanwhile, the sea only grew rougher, the wind whistling against the sails and the waves gradually rising, beating against the ship's side. Undaunted by such a raging storm, the pirates were determined to open the entrance, and soon I heard a strange clanging sound above my head. It was they who came from nowhere, bringing with them a hammer, and were about to smash the entrance in one go. My hands, which were holding the lid, felt extreme pain from the sound, and after the hammer had come down 7 or 8 times, I finally could not bear it any longer and let go of my hands, and in an instant one side of the entrance was shattered, and I looked up to see the demonic faces of the pirates. 2 or 3 of them immediately put their hands on the breach and, emitting strange, mocking cries, pulled the lid up, and it slid open with a grating sound 5 inches. 1 foot. One of the pirates, about 15 centimeters tall and holding his sword in reverse, had blazing eyes and tried to dive towards me. I was now in a desperate situation, so I instinctively screamed and tried to hide in the bottom of the ship, but at that moment, there was a sound as if the heavens and the earth were collapsing, and the ship instantly rose into the sky, then seemed to sink into the abyss. At the same time, I fell headfirst from the middle rung of the ladder into the bottom of the ship. I remember screaming that I'd failed, but after that, I lost all sense of identity. While I was unconscious, I was asleep and also dead. I didn't know how much time had passed, and I don't remember if an hour, a day, or even a week had passed, but I was neither dreaming nor waking. I suddenly felt someone hitting me on the head, and when I opened my eyes, I was still alive. When I thought about it, the ship's rocking had not stopped, and after I had lost consciousness for a while, the ship tilted violently again due to the huge waves crashing against it, and I rolled over from one side to the other and hit my head, and only now did I regain consciousness. It wasn't someone else who hit my head, I hit my own head. Anyway, I got up and looked around, and before I knew it, seawater had seeped in and my whole body was like a wet rat. Was it water entering from the bottom of the ship? Or was it the rising of the deck? I don't know if there were waves coming in from the landing gate, but the seawater had put out all the lights around me, and it was pitch black all around. Only one ship's light, which was hanging high at the stern of the ship, was about to go out, but had not yet gone out, and only emitted a faint, eerie blue light. I didn't know the time or where I was, so I took out my watch and saw that the hands had already stopped. My watch lasted 2 days, and I had wound the crown a few hours before the tragedy occurred, so when I saw the watch stop, I knew that I had been unconscious for at least 2 days. I wondered what those pirates had done, so I quietly stood up and listened carefully. Outside the ship, the wind and waves were still howling, but I couldn't hear any human voices. I couldn't help but feel uneasy, wondering how long they might remain hidden beneath the ship, but I could not relax until I knew what the pirates had become. Finally, I made up my mind and, tiptoeing, headed toward the entrance. I was halfway up the ladder and listened carefully, but still could not hear any voices. When I thought about it, I realized that the lid that the pirates had begun to open a moment ago had somehow been closed again. I think that when the pirates had half pulled the lid up, I had instinctively put my hand down due to the sudden, violent tremor. If I let go, the lid would fall back and close the access hole as before, but the gap where the pirates had smashed it with their hammer remained, and seawater would pour into the ship through it, wetting the iron railing and ladder. If I wasn't careful, I would slip down. The sea seemed to have calmed down a little now, and there was no sign of raging water pouring in through the gap, but the storm had not stopped. The ship was still rocking violently, and I could hear the sound of giant waves crashing onto the deck from time to time. Standing halfway up the ladder, I listened carefully for a while, wondering whether I should go up from here or not. If there were still pirates on deck, I would be killed immediately. However, I could not feel at ease until I saw the scene on deck, so I finally made up my mind and started to climb again, prepared to be killed. I climbed to the top of the ladder, still trying to make as little noise as possible, opened the hatch cover, and with great trepidation I stuck half my body out to look at the scene on deck, but oh, what a scene on the deck! I have never seen such an unexpected sight in my life. I had assumed that the deck would be littered with the corpses of the crew and that the pirates were still wreaking havoc, but my expectations were completely contrary. The deck was deserted and there was almost nothing there. There were no pirates and no dead crew members either. I was so shocked and suspicious that I immediately jumped onto the deck and took a closer look. Everything on the deck had been destroyed, and the corpses of the crew had been washed away. There was not a single drop of blood left. Furthermore, the compass was smashed, and the 2 pontoons that had been on the ship had been swallowed up by the sea. The captain's cabin, which had been standing at the bow, it had probably been taken away somewhere, and there was not a trace or shape of it. The ship had originally been equipped with 3 masts, but 2 of them had broken off in the middle, and their whereabouts, along with the sails, were unknown. All that remained on the vast ship was a single main mast, which was located in the center of the deck. More than a third of the sail that was stretched out from the top of the mast had already been torn, but the ship was moving like an arrow in the fierce gale. I did not know why the ship was moving so fast with only 1 sail, and was about to approach the main mast without thinking, when suddenly I saw a terrifying person standing underneath it. I instinctively ran away, and as I ran I turned around and saw that the man had not pursued me, and was still standing there motionless. Strange, I thought. Being a coward, I stopped and looked again, and realized that he should not have pursued me, nor should he have moved. He was already dead, with his head hanging down, and judging from his clothes, he must have been the leader of the pirates. He had thrown his sword onto the deck and tied himself tightly to the main mast. It really didn't make sense to me, but after thinking about it for a while, I nodded. I thought that the moment I had lost consciousness, the ship had experienced a great earthquake, and that it had been the eruption of an undersea volcano, which had caused an astonishingly huge wave to fall on the ship. If not, the ship had been caught in a tornado, and the ship had been blown up into a storm. The pirates on board were worried about their own safety before they could kill him, and while they were all in shock and chaos, the man, being the leader of the pirates, quickly tied him to the mast and prevented him from being carried away by the giant waves. However, he could not escape divine punishment for killing someone, and as the giant waves crashed against him several times, he stopped breathing, and was hit by pieces of the ship's equipment, and while he was still tied to the mast, he probably became a demon in the other world. Looking at him, there were numerous bruises on his forehead and chest, and although there were no bloodstains now, the wounds had been washed white by the seawater, which made him look even more terrifying. Needless to say, the other pirates had been swallowed up by the giant waves. Seeing this horrible scene, I was struck by an indescribable sadness. I stood on the deck in a daze for about 30 minutes, looking around in all directions. As far as the eye could see, there was an endless ocean, and not a single island or ship was in sight, just like before I fainted. However, the view of the world was several times more desolate and terrifying than before. Needless to say, I had no idea where on the ocean we were, or in what direction the ship was sailing, and when I tried to look at the compass, it was already broken. What's even more depressing is that I don't know if it's day or night. The clock has stopped, and looking at the sky, I can't see the sun, nor the stars, or the moon. It's not pitch black all around, but it's dim, and everything in the sky looks a murky yellow, as if it was covered in mud. That's why I mistook the pirate leader who had died a moment ago for a living, frightening human being. Where in the world could such a strange sight possibly exist? I pondered for 2 or 3 minutes, but then I suddenly let out a cry of despair that shocked even me. Eternal night! Eternal night! Can eternal night exist on this earth? Yes, it does. No one has seen it yet, but I have heard that on this earth, at the ends where humans cannot go, there is no day, only night. Oh, eternal night! Eternal night! The sailing ship I'm on, Biafra, is heading for the end of the earth, where humans cannot go, and is shrouded in eternal night. Oh, how far is the sailing ship Biafra going to sail with me on board? In the past, people used to say that the end of the earth is a huge cliff, and if the ship reaches it, it will be pulled into the hands of the devil and fall into an infinite abyss. No one believes such a thing now, but regardless of whether it is a cliff at the end of the earth or not, my ship is now, moment by moment, leading me to the place of death. So the sunset I saw before I fainted was the last time I would see the sun in this world. Despair! Despair! I was going almost crazy, and I really didn't want to go to the end of the earth, so I had to stop the ship, so I ran frantically to the bow of the ship, picked up the large anchor, which one would normally be unable to move by oneself, in both hands, and threw it into the sea. But what foolishness was it to try to stop a ship that was moving like a wild beast with an anchor? Before the anchor reached the bottom of the sea, the anchor rope snapped, and the ship moved even faster. The only anchor had already sunk to the bottom of the sea, and in despair I sat on the deck, but after a while I came to my senses and realized that my whole body had become like a board. Don't ask why. I hadn't thought about it until now because of the shock and sadness I had been feeling earlier, but it's so cold out at sea. It felt as if my breath was instantly turning to snow and freezing, and my clothes, soaked from head to toe with seawater, had frozen before I knew it, and were bending like boards. My clothes were already frozen to the deck, and it was difficult to stand up. I would rather just freeze to death, but I still had some regrets. When I tried to stand up, which was difficult to do, the ice did not come off and my clothes ripped with a crackling sound. The wind was cold as it hit my exposed skin. The wind seemed to be getting fiercer and fiercer. The sea foamed and roared, the raging waves crashed onto the deck once more, and the giant waves threatened to swallow me up. Even the wind tried to blow me away. I was so terrified that I could not bear it, and instinctively fled to the bottom of the ship. Suddenly, I saw a ray of light flickering on the dark sea. Oh, light! Light! In this situation, there was nothing more nostalgic than light. I thought the sun had appeared before my eyes once more, but when I looked again, the light had disappeared beneath the waves without a trace. This must be the Hesperus, the sparkling light on the sea that sometimes appears in the Antarctic. I could no longer cry out in despair. Meanwhile, the ship was moving faster and faster, and the further the ship went, the more intense the cold became, closing in on me. In the end, I fled to the bottom of the ship again, but even though my stomach was starving, I had no desire to eat. Without thinking, I immediately ran to the storehouse at the stern of the ship and put on more blankets on top of the ones I had put on, but it still didn't keep the cold out. With each passing moment, like the ticking of a clock, it got colder and colder. This must be because the ship was getting closer to the iceberg with each passing moment. As the cold got worse, I took the blankets that were piled up beside me and layered them 1/10 of a second, 1/9 of a second, 1/8 of a second, and finally one every 3 minutes. I had worn out dozens of blankets, and now I had nothing left to wear. I was wrapped up in a pile of blankets and could not move, but the cold did not subside. In fact, it increased more rapidly than before. It felt as if my flesh was being torn apart and my bones were freezing. How could I endure this cold? I ran around like crazy in the unbearable pain, but just as my feet were about to reach the bow and stern from the center of the ship's bottom, there was a sound as if the whole ship was being crushed, and the ship suddenly stopped, followed by a trembling sound and something on the ship. The sounds of the ship struggling, the waves crashing against the deck, and the wind fighting against the masts were so terrifying that I almost fainted, but this was not to be. When the shaking of the ship finally subsided, I cautiously crawled out from the bottom of the ship onto the deck, and saw that before me was a huge iceberg towering above the sky. The ship I was on had finally reached the end of the earth, and we had just run aground on the tip of this huge iceberg. It was the end of all. I instinctively threw myself onto the deck and cried, but how could crying help me escape this tragic situation? After a while, I stood up on the deck again, but perhaps because we had now reached the end of the earth and were in the shadow of a huge iceberg, the wind had stopped blowing at some point. When the ship ran aground on the tip of the iceberg, the raging waves that had been raging in response to the impact gradually calmed down, and the surroundings suddenly became silent. At the frightening end of the earth, there was not a single human being other than myself, no birds, no beasts, not even fish, and truly, in this space between heaven and earth, there was nothing more terrifying than not being able to hear a sound. I nearly fainted from the loneliness, but finally I regained my senses and looked around me, and the darkness between heaven and earth was still the same. In that darkness, I suddenly spotted a huge monster. What a monster! What a strange thing! The monster was lined up next to the starboard side of my ship, almost touching it, and was as motionless as a mountain, and its shape was black like a giant mountain. Was it a huge iceberg? Was it a huge iceberg? No, if it was a large iceberg, it should have been white. I couldn't help but wonder, gazing at it with wide eyes, but it was so dark and gloomy that I couldn't possibly discern its true form. Meanwhile, the cold was getting worse, and if it continued like this for another 10 minutes, I would freeze to death. Oh, how could I keep myself from getting this cold? I had already worn out dozens of blankets, and there was nothing left to wear. I looked around with bloodshot eyes. The thought suddenly occurred to Isaku, and like a mad beast he ran and jumped to the bottom of the ship. And before he could grab the one remaining light that was still out, he smashed it, scattered oil all over the ship, and set it on fire. The flames, like the tongue of a devil, crawled around the ship in an instant, and then, together with swirling black smoke, a raging fire rose up in flames. I jumped onto the deck and said, "Oh, I will burn my ship, if I ever wish to return to the human world from the ends of the earth. I must destroy this ship." With nothing to rely on, the ship was burning, and I was constantly suffering from the cold, and my life was burning away. With this in mind, I hurriedly tried to put out the fire, but if the fire was put out, I would freeze to death immediately. The time that the fire was on was the time that I would live.